Okay, chapter 1. And what I did just notice on this very front page, I did learn that reading out loud on YouTube is illegal unless it's public domain. This is public domain. I did just learn that. Pride and Prejudice is public domain, so I probably won't get in trouble for reading things out loud, which is good. But this says that Jane Austen was born in 1775 and died in 1817. Look, she didn't even live that long. And also, I always think about, like, just because when I was in school, you think about things with such this myopic lens of, like, passing the test. And so now that I'm an adult of some kind, I'm like, oh my God, that was, like, near the American Revolution. Like, I just I didn't even, I just didn't even think about it. Now I'm like, oh, 1776, this is the American Revolution. Whoa. That's so interesting. Like, what was her life like? And how did Jane Austen die? I don't know. How did Jane Austen die? Jane Austen die. Addison's disease, which involves the destruction of the adrenal glands. Girl was stressed out. It was stressful. Whoa. She died in Winchester, United Kingdom. But other medical opinion surmises that Jane may have been suffering from Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer. Oh, like, we don't really know. Of course we don't know. She died at 41. Jane Austen was 41 when she died. 200 years ago. That sounds so crazy. Well, we don't know why she died so young. Lymphoma, even accidental arsenic poisoning. Okay, that was pretty classic back then, huh? Arsenic poisoning, classic. I mean, who would have poisoned her? Whoa. Do you think she poisoned herself? Okay, we don't need to talk about that, but whoa, how was Jane Austen murdered with arsenic? Highly likely that Austen was suffering from arsenic poisoning after being prescribed it by a doctor for another disease. Anything can be a poison or a medicine. Wow. Okay. Honestly, I did just finish reading this book, and I kind of read books like to finish them. I just realized. So that's also why I want to kind of like reread it with whoever decides to watch, whoever is out there, just because I want to like enjoy it now. I mean, I enjoyed it, but I think I was just comparing it to the movie the whole time because that's all I really know about it is just the Keira Knightley movie. Like, I was just like, oh, this happened in the Keira Knightley movie. I call it the Keira Knightley movie. Like, that's... Okay, chapter 1. Good. I'm good. I am going to read it with a British accent because we just kind of have to. So, sorry ahead of time. It is a universal... Whoa. Take 2. Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, the truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. My dear Mr. Bennet, said his lady to him one day, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last? I loved that actress that played the mom in the Keira Knightley movie. Sorry, I'm just going to be talking about that one a lot because it's so beautiful. She was so good. That was from 2005. 2005. Netherfield Park is let at last. She was so good. That was not good, but who was that? God, is she still alive? Donald Sutherland, R.I.P. Brenda Blethyn. Still alive. Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. But it is, she returned, for Mrs. Long was just been there, and she told me all about it. Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do you not want to know who has taken it? Cried his wife impatiently. You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it. This was invitation enough. Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of a large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place. I think we're going to learn a lot about different types of carriages, because I feel like they just have, I never bothered to like look it up before, but every time I read a word that I don't know, I think it is a type of carriage. A chaise cart. A light chaise having 2 seats is a double chair. A chaise cart is a light carriage used for transporting lightweight goods instead of people. Oh. Mr. Bingley came in a chaise, whatever that means, to see the place, and was so much delighted in it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas. Michaelmas? And some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. Michaelmas. That sounds like Christmas. Michaelmas. What is it? What is Michaelmas? The feast of Michael and all angels signifies the end of the harvest, the start of autumn, and the beginning of the shorter days. Whoa, September. Should we all celebrate Michaelmas this year? Western Christian Church. Michaelmas. September 29th, you guys. It's only February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September. It's only 7 months away. Michaelmas, I've never heard it in my whole entire life. And I already read this book, but I don't even remember saying that. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune for a 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls, she's so sure. How so? How can it affect them? Oh, Mr. Bennet, teasing your wife. My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I'm thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design nonsense! How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. Such a good scene. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or may send them by themselves, which perhaps will still be better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. She ought to give over thinking. Give over thinking. She ought to give over thinking of her beauty, her own beauty. Now we say get over, and she said give over? In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighbourhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. You're over-scrupulous, surely. Scrupulous. I, know what that means, but I don't exactly know what I'm going to look it up. Scrupulous, because my brain has a visual of what scrupulous means, but I couldn't tell you for sure what it actually means. Diligent, scruples. Diligent, thorough, extremely attentive to detail. Whoa, scrupulous. Wow. You are over scrupulous, Shelley. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls. Though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. Oh, he loves little Lizzie. I desire you would do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia, but you are always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them. He replied. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion for my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these last 20 at least years. Years at least. Whoa. Do I have ADHD? I don't know. It's for you guys to decide. You do not know what I suffer, but I hope you will get over it. I lived to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighbourhood. It will be no use to us if 20 should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married in solace. Its solace was visiting and news. I'm going to get better at reading out loud. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. What a fun way to live. I need to know what caprice means because I heard it, I remember hearing it in the movie, and I kind of don't know what that means either. A sudden and unaccountable change of mood or behavior. Really? Sudden and unaccountable change. Okay. Chapter 2. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. Trickster. Until the evening after the visit he paid, she had no knowledge of it. Oh, he is such a trickster. It was then disclosed in the following manner, observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat. He suddenly addressed her with, I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie. We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes, said her mother resentfully, since we are not to visit. But you forget, mamma, said Elizabeth, that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long's promised to introduce him. I do not believe Mrs. Long would do such a thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman. I have no opinion of her. And I have no opinion of her. That's funny. No more have I, said Mr. Bennet. And I'm glad to find that you do not depend on serving her. Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. Do not keep coughing so, Kitty. For heaven's sake, have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces. Kitty has no discretion in her coughs, said her father. She times them ill. I do not cough for my own amusement, replied Kitty fretfully. When is your next ball to be, Lizzie? Tomorrow fortnight. Tomorrow fortnight? Is that like 14 days? Hold on. I just need to orient myself around tomorrow fortnight, like time. Hold on. Tomorrow fortnight meaning a period of 14 days. Okay. Okay. I can do that. So it is, cried her mother, and Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before, so it would be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself. Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend, and introduce Mr. Bingley to her. Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible, when I am not acquainted with him myself. How can you be so teasing? I honour your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will, and after all, Mrs. Long and her daughters must stand the chance. And therefore, as she will think it an act of kindness, if you decline the office, I will take it on myself. The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet said only, "Nonsense, nonsense!" "What can be the meaning of this emphatic exclamation?" cried he. "Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary?" "For a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make extracts." Mary wished to say something sensible, but knew not how. "While Mary is adjusting her ideas," he continued, "let us return to Mr. Bingley." I'm going to start saying that. I'm adjusting my ideas real quick. Hold on. Adjusting my ideas. That's funny. I like to annotate, not in the book. Adjusting. "I am sick of Mr. Bingley," cried his wife. Wow, we're on page 5 and she's already sick of hearing about Mr. Bingley. "I'm sorry to hear that, but why do you not tell me that before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would have not called on him. It is very unlucky, but I have actually paid the visit. We cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished. Oh, he loves to surprise her, except that she's going to lose it. Mrs. Bennet is going to lose it with this man. That of Mrs. Bennet, perhaps, surpassing the rest, though in the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all the while. How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet. But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. How well pleased I am, and it is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said such a word about it. Till now. "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet. That's so funny. So cool of a couple who just knows each other so well. Like, yeah, you can cough. Your mom's not even going to say anything now because she's happy. As he spoke, he left the room fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "What an excellent father you have, girls," she said when the door was shut. "I do not know, however, you will make him amends for his kindness, or me either for that matter. At our time in life, it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintances every day, but for your sakes we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I'm not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I'm the tallest." Not in the Keira Knightley movie, you weren't. Just kidding. The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Chapter 3. Not all that Mrs. Bennett, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject, was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. I feel like if I wrote that sentence at my high school English literature class, I would have gotten docked down. Too many commas. Doesn't start making sense. I feel like my teachers we should have just read Jane Austen. And then I would have been like, it's right here. It says it right there. English class. Definitely not a literature major. I'll tell you that. I'd love help learning how to read this with an English lit eye. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbour Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favourable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love. Dancing steps. And very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." In a few days Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies of whose beauty he had heard so much. But he saw only the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to housekeeping, and when an answer arrived which deferred it all, Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honour of their invitation, etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business could have in town so soon after his arrival to Hertfordshire, and she began to fear that he might always be flying from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield, as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to get a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. My goodness. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, right? But were comforted the day before the ball by hearing that instead of 12, he brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. Mr. Bingley has 5 sisters, my goodness. And when the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether. Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man, Mr. Darcy, I quite believe. What did these men do? Like, why did she think, like, what did Mr. Bingley do for a living? Mr. Bingley is a stranger to the community centered on the town, married, and all signs of his leasing, his coach, and not leasing income point to his being a gentleman. How did Mr. Bingley make his money? Bingley comes from a family who acquired their fortune in trade. His father worked hard as a merchant of some kind, which improved their financial and social status. I can do this. Bingley and his sisters are the first generation that does not have to work for a living. His wealth is said to be at £5,000 a year. What does Mr. Darcy do for a living? What? Darcy's wealth and status come from generations of accrued family money with interest, investments, and property land management. He's not a businessman nor a farmer per se, nor does he physically work for a living. Mr. Darcy's occupation is a gentleman. These people just have all day to do nothing. He doesn't do anything. Whoa. I feel really shocked. Okay, well, get into real estate, people. That's all I have to say. Does Mr. Darcy have autism? Okay, I'm getting distracted. Mr. Bingley was good looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, M-I-E-N, noble mien, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes of its entrance of his having 10,000 a year, because he's a gentleman and he has family wealth and he has generational wealth. That was a long sentence. Okay. The gentleman pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire, I wonder how to say that, could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared to with his friends. Whoa. Like, I remember reading this, obviously because I just finished the book, but I don't remember this distinctly. I have to read books twice. Let's read it. I'll read one book by myself, and then I'll read it again to the internet. And then I'll actually kind of understand. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend. Ugh. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in talking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Whoa! Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet. Oh, I don't remember this. Whose dislike of his general behaviour was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged by the scarcity of gentlemen to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join in. "Come, Darcy," he said, "you must have a dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You stupid son of a gun. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be unsupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." "I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Mr. Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honour, I never met with so many pleasant girls in all my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them you see uncommonly pretty. You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Ooh. Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I've ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who's very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" And turning round, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own coldly, and said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humour at present to give consequence to the young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your party and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings toward him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, and she had a lively, playful disposition which delighted in anything ridiculous. The evening altogether passed off pleasantly to the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighbourhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough never to be without partners, which was all that they had yet learnt to care for at a ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were the principal inhabitants. Okay, this is so crazy because the whole book, I was like, what is Longbourn? I don't get it. But Longbourn is the village where they lived, and they are the principal inhabitants of Longbourn. Okay, just read and comprehend things, Emily. Reading comprehension. They found Mr. Bennet still up. With a book, he was regardless of time, and on the present occasion he had a good deal of curiosity as to the events of an evening which had raised such splendid expectations. Oh, he didn't go to the ball. Oh. He had rather hoped that his wife's views on the stranger would be disappointed, but he soon found out that he had a very different story to hear. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," as she entered the room, "we have had the most delightful evening and a most excellent ball. I wish you had been there. Jane was so admired, nothing could be like it. Everybody said how well she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought her quite beautiful, and danced with her twice. Only think of that, my dear. He actually danced with her twice, and she was the only creature in the room that he asked a second time. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas. I was so vexed to see him stand up with her. But however, he did not admire her at all. Indeed, nobody can, and he seemed quite struck with Jane as she was going down to dance. So he inquired who she was and got introduced, and asked her for the two next. Then the 2/3 he danced with Miss King, and the 2/4 with Maria Lucas, and the 2/5 with Jane again, and on the 2/6 with Lizzie, and the Bollinger. If he had any compassion for me, cried her husband so impatiently, he wouldn't have danced half so much. For God's sake, say no more of his partners. Oh, that he sprained his ankle in the first dance. That's a grumpy little Gus. Oh, my dear, I'm quite delighted with him. He is so excessively handsome, and his sisters are charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace upon Mrs. Hurst's gown. Here she was interrupted again. Mr. Bennet protested against any description of finery. She was therefore obliged to seek another branch of the subject, and related with much bitterness of spirit and some exaggeration the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. But I can assure you, she added, that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he is a most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing, so high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so very great, not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to have given him one of your set-downs. I quite detest the man. Well, I think we should bid adieu to each other there. We shall continue on next time with chapter 4. And this has been a delight, and I'm so excited, and I hope you all have had fun. Have had as much fun as I have, but at the end of the ball we must retire. Happy reading!